Hi, I'm Elio Greco here with Gavin Klondike, and this is the Ethical Algorithm Podcast. Today we're talking about Scarlett Johansson, cloning voice actors, and also how education is being impacted by artificial intelligence.
Right on.
To you.
All right, yeah, I'll kick us off. So earlier, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a really fascinating story where OpenAI, they released their GPT-4o model. And with the GPT-4o model, it had a voice. And so the voice, people really compared to her. It sounded a little sexy, a little more sensual than it probably needed to be.
Just for lack of confusion, when you say her, the movie, Her, that's the title, right? Just
I was
know.
getting there. Yeah.
Oh, gotcha.
So no, it was a female voice for GPT-4o. They had since removed it. And the reason
it was
why they
Sky, wasn't it? Was the name?
Yeah, the name was Sky. So it was very reminiscent of Her, the movie. That's where I introduced it. So if you haven't seen the movie Her, basically a man falls in love with an artificial intelligence equivalent to Siri on his phone. And so the movie explores the dynamics of human intimacy and connection with artificial intelligence. Anyways, GPT-4o used a very similar voice. And it was too similar to the point where friends and family of actress Scarlett Johansson actually reached out to her and said, hey, this sounds like you. Were you doing stuff for OpenAI? Did you voice this? And she said, no. So she actually dug into it, took a look at it, because she wasn't really paying attention to the news and the stuff that was going on Twitter. And she realized, like, holy shit, this actually does sound like me. Now I need to tell this whole story. Well, from her side, what it sounded like originally, I'm going to tell you what it originally sounded like, and then I'll tell you exactly what happened. What it sounded like originally is OpenAI, back in when Sam Altman got fired back in October, November timeframe, they were asking her, hey, we have a model that we want you to do the voice for. And so after some careful consideration, she said no for ethical reasons. And so they said, okay, cool. Fast forward to today, and now she's hearing what sounds like her own voice, or at the very least indistinguishable to her friends and families from her and her own voice, voicing this system. And so that opened up a broader question in the Twitter sphere of, hey, this is an actress who said, no, I don't want to do the voiceover, and yet you cloned her voice anyways. Yeah. It turns out OpenAI didn't clone her voice. They didn't do any deepfakes or anything like that. But instead, they had hired an actress, a voice actress that sounds very similar to Scarlett Johansson, so that they can still have that replica of her. Scarlett Johansson, if you don't know, she's very litigious. She's not afraid to throw that weight around. This is somebody who sued Disney and won.
That's incredible, because usually that goes the other way.
It goes the other way. Exactly. And so now there's a lawsuit that Scarlett Johansson is engaging in with OpenAI, and it caused OpenAI to actually remove the Sky voice from GPT-4o. But it opens up two broader questions. One is, with generative AI and AI in general, if you decide to leave a company or decide not to do work for a certain company, do they have any right, or what are the constraints that they have on them, or restrictions or regulations that the company has on them, to not use your likeness or not use, previous work that you had done for them to generate new work? So imagine any voice actor or voice actress in things like video games. We had a news article. Again, there was a lot of controversy around this one. The video game Bayonetta 3, the original voice actress for Bayonetta 1 and 2 was complaining, saying, hey, I wasn't going to get paid enough for Bayonetta 3, and they decided not to use me. It turns out there's a lot more to that story than she was originally letting on, but the fact remains, as we're getting more and more advanced generative AI, what happens when a company decides to use your likeness, per whatever contract they had, in order to clone you? Or what happens when you're using a public platform, say Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, or whatever, to train a generative AI model, and then they can use your likeness or your voice to generate any sort of content that they decide to do without paying you or compensating you.
This is interesting. It's an evolution of, there's a hilarious article this guy wrote about advertising. So way back, Amazon was advertising, and they would just grab kind of your profile and be like, this person likes this product. And some of the connections between the products and the person were pretty tenuous. And so I don't remember if he'd even looked at the product maybe just once, but apparently there's a Japanese game show that's hilarious where you're trying to climb these stairs that are super slippery.
Yeah.
That's one of the people that might want to buy a 55-gallon drum of personal lubricant.
Was that the product?
And so this guy, he had, I think, clicked on it maybe once. He had never bought it. And Amazon was, to all his friends, they're like, Bob likes, 55-gallon drum of personal lubricant. And he's like, oh, God. Like, all his friends like, dude, what the hell is this all about? So we've already seen over the last 20 years people using people's likeness in a more mundane way to sell and push products. So this is the same thing. This is just one more thing where AI, it's not the first time. It's not a new threat that we've never seen before. But it's more intricate. It's, the person like him actually saying, I love this, drum of, right?
Yeah, it adds more fuel to the fire, because there was that case where a father found out his daughter was pregnant because of targeted advertising from his local grocery store.
And they didn't stop doing that, right? So they got so good at finding out, I don't think it was even which trimester. I think it was which month of a pregnancy, just from all the data brokerage and data mining a woman was in. Yeah. And they sent this teenage girl like pregnancy ads, this whole mailer full of diapers and baby supplies. Yeah. And the father was furious. Turns out she was pregnant. And there's some caveats there, but this close enough, right? And they didn't stop doing that. They're like, that's creeping people out. So what we're going to do is we're going to send them a mailer, and instead of just 100% baby products, we're going to have like diapers and a lawnmower and then like baby wipes and then like a kitchen, and try to make it look like, well, there seems to be a few more baby products in here than usual. So they're still doing that. They just are better at not tipping people off.
I just throw them away. I don't even know what info they have on me.
Yeah, it's getting insane. The data brokerage thing, we won't tangent into that, but there's a grocery store chain that I learned they make about 2/3 of their money now from selling your purchasing history.
I believe
that. And they just incidentally still sell groceries, but that's not how they make their money anymore.
I believe that. Yeah.
Anyway, so it's interesting, and we were talking earlier before we hit record. So once again, this stuff is not new. There's a movie that it's an older movie. It has Kirstie Alley, I think, is in there. It has Gene Simmons as the bad guy, and I'm totally blanking on the main actor's name here. But it's called Runaway from 1984, if you want to look it up on IMDb or just watch, which is a great place to find out which streaming service you need to watch the thing. But it's really prescient. It's kind of wacky, as these 80s movies were. But it's really Tom Selleck. There we go. I don't know why I couldn't remember, but Tom Selleck is the main guy. He's supposed to be an officer that hunts down rogue androids, and then there's a whole plot of these compromised chips that are letting them take over the androids and use them for nefarious purposes. I don't want to give a whole plot away, but I believe, if I'm not misremembering, that was the movie where they actually covered this, and they had a scene where actresses in the movie would get almost unclothed in like really tight, skin suit, and get into a scanner, and it would scan their body, and it would take their likeness, and then they would make commercials off of, just the likeness of the actress. So I think this is in the 80s that people were like saying, look, we'll just grab the person's likeness. We don't actually need them. We can just crank out as many commercials as we want once we have their likeness. And so they were already talking about that back then. And we've had the technology, full body scanners for anyone who subscribed to Computer Graphics World. Like, if you had the money, you could get one of those back in the 90s. Yeah. They were, millions of dollars, but full body scan in 12 seconds. So you could then model the person and, pull them into movies.
So you buy one of those, scan 10 actors, and now you can release a whole bunch of films. Hallmark would make a killing. Every single plot of a Hallmark movie is identical. For whatever reason, they're always in Christmas. Yeah. Somebody gets snowed in. It's sometimes they change it up. Sometimes it's a really busy businesswoman from the city, and she goes out into like a more rural country town, and she falls in love with some carpenter or something. Or sometimes they swap it up, and it's some really busy dude lawyer who goes from a busy city into a more rural country town and falls in love with a baker. And it's they would pump out so many movies.
We've now optimized Hallmark and Lifetime.
We have now optimized Hallmark.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It gets almost to identity and epistemology of identity, like who are you and what are your rights to your likeness? And we're having to confront these in ways that, again, we've seen glimpses, but to a degree now that we've never seen before. And it's terrifying because some of the precedent for this is the tech industry. right? A lot of the tech industry, if you sign a contract and you go work for some big tech company, whatever you invent, on the clock or not, if you're in a salaried position, is theirs.
Oh, and that doesn't even include the non-competes.
Yeah.
So we have a non-AI analog to this, where it's who owns what. The one that I was thinking about was Taylor Swift, where she doesn't actually own her own albums.
That's
so
why
she doesn't have the master copyright for her own albums. So she had to go and re-record all of her old stuff in order to retain the master of that. And that opened up a whole conversation in the music industry. So we are seeing that in non-AI ways. But going back to like movies and TV shows, one of the TV shows that I really like and I highly recommend, it's terrifying as shit, but like it's essentially about AIs. It's called Pantheon. I think it was on Paramount Plus. You can see it on Amazon Prime. But Pantheon, the idea is like, why are we working on artificial intelligence when we could do uploaded intelligences? And so we can scan a human brain and then upload that to a computer. Now, the downside is that to scan your brain, it's a very destructive process. They have to use lasers in order to essentially destroy every molecule of your brain so they can remap it into the computer. So you can't do it when you die. You have to be alive when it happens.
So that covers the problem of like what happens like to you. Like, great, you upload your brain, you got a copy living in the cloud, but then what about the part of you that didn't get uploaded? So that covers that.
Terrifies. Here's the scene that terrified me. So the beginning, it follows three main characters. One of the characters, he was looking at leaving his company for another company that was actually pursuing this technology. He thought it was really cool. His company caught wind of it, and so he's kidnapped.
Okay.
They strap him down to a chair and then actually start doing the operation. They have a video camcorder on him, and he's begging. He's like, please, no, I'm not going to leave the company. I'll do whatever you need. Just like, don't scan me into the system because I don't want to die. Yeah. Basically. And so they scan him, and it's just his brain is getting deleted as he's begging. His speech starts slurring. It turns into word salad.
High-tech version of Silence of the Lambs.
Terrifying. Yeah, it's so it's so weird. But they scan him into the system, and then what they do is they actually build out his office and set up a day, like in the middle of the day.
Okay.
Because some of our creative work is emotional, and so in the middle of the day, he gets a call from his mom, and he's like, "Okay, cool, whatever, mom." Like, she's like, "Oh, well, when are you gonna give me grandkids?" Well, eventually, mom. Don't worry about it. But he loops the day over and over and over again, and so he's doing work for the company now forcibly. So it's a whole nother level of slavery. And so if you're able to take somebody's likeness and generate content off of them, they no longer have the ability to say, hey, you can't do that. It's like, no, it's a corporate asset. So that's terrifying to me because I don't want somebody essentially cloning myself or my work and using it in ways that I don't approve of. And as we're getting more advanced generative AI, we're starting to see this in other areas. So even though that isn't what happened in the Scarlett Johansson example, it does open up some of these ethical and considerations when it comes to who owns likeness, who owns content produced.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah, it's really raising some interesting questions about the self and where the self and the digital self, where are they connected, where are they not? And because we don't have a proper identity protocol, like how do you know, right? How do you actually know whether this person actually said that and intended to, or someone else is just making it look like they said that on their behalf? And that's something I think that, they're talking about watermarking AI, and I think it's kind of a misguided conversation.
I don't think that's going to happen.
It's not going to work, even if it happens, because the idea is like, well, we'll watermark it. We'll cryptographically watermark that, whenever this stuff gets put out there, this is generated. And it's like, okay, great, you could do that. But the problem is there will always be people. There's already models out there, AI models, that are already unconstrained that you can download for free, and you can rebuild them. I mean, they're hard to build, but they're not impossible to build. So even if you get rid of everything out there, like, you cannot guarantee that the most malicious actors will watermark their stuff. It's non-viable. And all of the detection stuff I've seen for detecting AI-generated content, like, it used to be really easy. Just look at the hands. Oh, he's got 7 fingers, right? Like, that's obviously AI.
Now it can do text.
Yeah. And text was the thing that was the dead giveaway, but it's getting better and better. And usually it's around 50-50, right? Like, it just is not reliable. The only thing that I've seen that I don't know, you might know more of the research than I saw one paper, or actually one talk, about how to detect AI written text reliably. And supposedly this guy's saying that you can use the derivative of the perplexity.
Yep.
And basically say, so perplexity is how weird, how different is the next word, and people have constant perplexity. A given person on a given topic, because they just have their vocabulary, that perplexity will stay constant across the entire conversation, whereas AI, you get this crazy sawtooth pattern where the perplexity is all over the place. And he's like, that is a pretty reliable way to say this is language model generated. This did not come from a person.
Perplexity and burstiness are two of the major factors that you want to look at when you're trying to identify AI written content. The other thing that you want to look at is word choice. There's certain words that AI will say. And there was a study where they were looking at academic papers to see how many of these were actually generated by AI. And they found out there's a handful of words that were consistently generated by AI. And they looked at like the last 10 years of papers, and they saw that those words showed up very, very rarely. And then all of a sudden, 2022, 2023, it just shot straight up.
And you don't even have to get that sophisticated. There was a Google Scholar search that started with certainly here is.
Yeah, there's a number of those for sure. People are still leaving in those, like the parts of the prompts are like, sure, here's this, or like as an AI.
And then there is one that I was watching. I was going through Reddit looking for other topic at what's happening with schools and education, and this one teacher's like, it's great. She's like, here's what I recommend. If you have questions about whether this was written by the student, call them, get them on speakerphone with their parents, or actually call the parents, get them on speakerphone. And she's like, I want you to explain in your own words what vacillating between extrema means. And the kid's like, I forget what grade level, but they had no idea what those words mean. You're
there's
like,
certain words that pop out of ChatGPT that the kids just aren't familiar with, or there's certain phrases or terminologies that, hey, what did you mean when you wrote this? And then they can't reiterate it. So it's really fascinating. I have a lot that I was finding on the teacher subreddit when it came to ChatGPT and large language models, because it is impacting education. And I think this is probably a good point for us to kind of pivot over to that conversation. So when we were planning for this episode, just to let everybody in, we found a couple articles talking about students no longer being creative because of generative AI, teachers catching students because of generative AI. And so we said, you know what, let's actually dig a little deeper into this and see how are things like generative AI and large language models, especially ChatGPT, influencing education, because it's definitely making an impact. I remember when I was in school, right, we had math class, and you weren't supposed to use a calculator for your math class. And it's like, oh, well, in the real world, I'll be able to use a calculator. It's like, that's not the point. You need to learn how to use these tools. And the only way to do it is to actually do it manually. And so it's this concept that I call don't kill the butterfly, where if you see a cocoon, right, you have a caterpillar and it turns into a cocoon, and then the butterfly breaks out of the cocoon and then it flies away, right? That's normally how the metamorphosis is done. So if you see a cocoon and the butterflies, when it breaks out, it's a struggle. But if you see it kind of struggling and then you open the cocoon for the butterfly, what you'll see is it'll kind of like sit out on the out, flap its wings a little bit, and then it'll try and fly, but it'll fall straight to the ground and die. And the reason why is because that struggle of breaking out of the cocoon built up its muscles in order to actually fly.
Interesting.
So struggle is part of the process. And when you remove that struggle, trust me, I hate struggle. I want to make things as easy as possible for myself. But when you remove that struggle, you lose some of that.
Go on.
I was going to say, when it comes to especially text, like if you're going to generate an essay or something like that, or there was one of the systems that you shared in our group chat of, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, let me get back to, let me say what I was going to say. So paradox of automation, very much what you're saying. So when you have these planes, like big Airbus planes, they are some of the newer ones are very automated, and they work really well. They're not Boeing. They have like quorum computers, like 11 computers, so more, like 7 of them will have to screw up. So anyway, really easy to fly. And so the problem is when you're flying one of these, right, and you get up to altitude, just the act of putting the plane in cruise control, right, pilots are judged on how many flight hours they have.
Right.
But if you're just sitting there, even if there's no turbulence and you're just kind of cruising along, but you have your hands on, well, I guess not a stick in an Airbus, it would be a little joystick, right? But you're actively flying the plane, no matter how low skill, you are still establishing neural pathways. Like it's still, you're getting some practice, even if it's not much. When you put it on autopilot and you take your hand off the stick and you're not gaining anything. And so the paradox of automation is that automation makes the little problems go away. It makes them easier, makes them disappear. Yeah. But then when you do like, oh, shoot, we have to take evasive action, there's insane turbulence, whatever, right? You do not have the training you would have had if you had been just manually flying it, and you're even less capable of dealing with the problem. So automation, it makes the little problems easier and go away, and it makes the big problems much worse because now you have you haven't actually learned how to do the thing. So it ties in exactly with what you're saying.
Yeah. The part that I was getting ahead of myself on is, one, we can talk about students writing essays, and we definitely want to get to that. But there was a program that you entered into our group chat that was really interesting. There was a student, they were actually about to get kicked out of school. What was it? They were going to get kicked out of Harvard or Stanford.
Oh, I was thinking of the younger kid. Which one are you thinking of?
It was the...
yeah, that's right.
So it reads research papers for you.
Okay, I was thinking of the other one. Yes, let me see, Moira or something?
Something like that, yeah. So this is an AI that will read research papers for you. And so the person who made it, they were a college student, and they were actually being threatened to get kicked out of school. And people would be like, why would you get kicked out of school for building an app?
Yeah,
this is
really
cool.
Honestly, I got a little pissed when I read the headline on Hacker News because, like, they're telling me they're going to kick me out if I don't shut down my startup. And I'm like, oh, schools, going after entrepreneurs. But then I actually read it, and I'm like, that's not what's going on. They actually have a pretty valid point here, this school.
Right. My interpretation is that you need to read a lot of research papers in order to develop the skill set to understand is this a good research paper? Did they set up the experiment properly? How should I set up my research paper? And so the struggle is part of the process. You need to get that content in there. After a while, right, especially for PhDs, they don't need to go through that struggle anymore. So a tool like that would be great. But for undergrads, you need to build up the skills. For me personally, when we were going through COVID, I got scared, right? 2020, March, April, that whole early period. When I get scared, I do research. So I actually, from my own academic background, started reading health journals and medical journals.
Yeah.
And so medical journals, there are certain considerations that you need to take into account, things that are specific in the medical field that aren't in, say, the computer science field.
Yes.
So, for example, I had to teach myself what hazard ratios are. I had to teach myself more details about p-values, because p-values aren't in computer science, not to the same extent.
Not really, yeah.
Yeah. I had to teach myself about certain biases. For example, the infinite time bias. The infinite time bias only exists in the medical space. What that is if you have your test group and your control group, and you say, okay, day 1, experiment starts, but then, by day 3, day 4, somebody in your test group starts to have an adverse reaction or they have to leave. What people will do is take that number and move it into the control group and say like, oh, well, they didn't actually go through the whole test.
Oh, that's kind of dirty.
So the reason why it's called the infinite time bias is because if you let infinite time go on, then you can put whoever you don't like into that control group.
Right, yeah, because infinitely, yes, everyone will die eventually.
Yeah. One of the studies that I had read, and I'm not going to, this is what I was talking about the other day. I'm not going to mention which study it is.
Gotcha.
But the study itself said, hey, according to our test and control group, nobody in our test, it was a medication, nobody in our test group died or went to the hospital. And then you read, the very next line, if you ignore the people who died and went to the hospital.
Yeah.
And so they had taken them out of the study, which influences the study itself. So I had to read a lot of medical journals. There were a lot of articles that were just hot garbage.
Yeah.
That is my professional opinion. That is the technical term, hot garbage. No. So no, they were absolutely terrible. But the only way that you can identify whether or not it's terrible is if you had gone through the struggle of understanding what good articles look like versus bad articles, because that is a problem in academia. And so
and
that's where you lose that ability if you use a tool like Morphia or Morbius or whatever it's called.
I found it. I'll read it in a sec. But there's the conscious aspect of training yourself to read a research paper. But there's also a lot of subconscious. Like one thing, I think a useful way to look at like what is mastery, like how would you define mastery of something, is there's a lot of subconscious stuff that as you as you work on different skills, you kind of, I don't want to say internalize, but it goes from being a conscious act, like driving a car. When you start driving a car, you're just thinking about everything, and your reaction time is very slow, and you're just not very good. And then
that was me when I first got my learner's permit. And it was terrible.
As you do more and more, that goes from being a conscious thing you do, and it gets pulled into the subconscious. And like now I've been doing that for decades, right? Like I can hold a conversation, and I've had incidents on the road where I need to take evasive action to not hit something, and it just happens, and I'm almost surprised that I just dodged that thing totally successfully. I didn't think about it. My body's just like, well, we got to turn this to do this, and we're away from it in the other lane and didn't hit anything. And one time I actually dodged toward the median, and there was probably less than a foot of space between my car and the freeway going 80 in the median, but I got around the obstacle and didn't hit anything. Yeah. And like, I only noticed what had happened. Like, I'm coming back into lane and recentering now consciously. And I'm like, that went pretty well. There was really very little space there. And I was just able to do it totally subconsciously. And it's the same with martial arts, musical instruments, everything else. Like, that's the only way to actually multitask.
Yeah, mind-body connection.
But it takes enough hours of, and it's not the 10,000 hour rule or whatever that is that got all trendy for a while. It's not just hours put in. It's focused hours, right? You have to be actively doing the thing and thinking to really get good. But even if you're not really focused, you could still get better and still kind of turn something subconscious. And I think that's true of research papers too. So the question is, the app in question is Moltar, MOLTAR.io or .ai. And so Moltar, it says, turns hours of homework into minutes. Simply upload any document, URL, or YouTube video, and Moltar will analyze the content, offering instant responses and insights to all your questions. Try it out for free below. And what's really interesting, it says below, they have all these logos of these top-tier universities. But what it says right above it is trusted by students at top universities.
Oh, so there's some branding there.
Yeah, and so not the universities, because they're the ones they're threatening to kick him out. So they have Columbia, they have Yale, Harvard, Princeton, MIT, and Stanford.
All the logos
listed,
you would want to see. On
by students though, not by the university. Yeah. So it's basically like the old Cliff Notes thing, right? When we were in school,
or Chegg, where they just give you the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there value in reading the Cliff Notes version? You didn't actually read the book, so any nuance that was there, you don't have any of that nuance, right? You just got the answers, and so it's a lesser experience. So this is basically just using AI to do bespoke, when needed Cliff Notes. Now, the one thing I will say that makes me a little bit nervous is the propensity of AI to confabulate or hallucinate.
Right. Because I think when you're doing something like RAG, it kind of reduces. But let's pause for now. Sure. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll hop back in, because I definitely want to see what this looks like when we bring it down into school age, right? K through 12.
Gotcha.
So for now, we're just going to pause, and we'll hop back in a second.
Welcome back. We're continuing the conversation on AI and its impacts on education and schooling.
Yeah. So there were 3 articles. Well, actually 2 articles, and then we were just trolling around Reddit for a little bit. So the first article was talking about a teacher just disheartened and saddened by catching one of her underperforming students actually cheating. And then the second article was an actual scholarly article talking about kids losing creativity because of generative AI. Now, that second one, I wasn't too familiar with. Do you want to give us a quick recap on it?
I'm trying to think. So I have not read deeply into that, but I was looking at it a little bit because it relates, I believe, to what's called knowledge collapse. And we've talked about model collapse previously.
Yeah.
But so model collapse, overfitting, catastrophic interference, and model collapse are risks as you train AIs, right? They can actually get a lot worse as you give them more data. But there's a related sociological phenomenon we're talking about now called knowledge collapse. And the gist of this is that as people use these generative models, they are generative, and they tend toward, not a lot of stuff in life actually does Gaussian distribution, where you have like a bell curve, right, where there's most stuff right in the middle, and then it kind of, the distribution kind of fades toward the sides. But these do, right? So if you ask it questions, it tends toward the most common, most probable answer. And so as people start, I'll just ask AI about it. I'll have it explain it to me. as people do that more and more, you have more people being kind of steered toward the middle of the
Yeah,
conversation.
like a more generalized answer.
Yeah, which is not terrible necessarily, but also there's some implications there. Because in a normal human society, there's a certain amount of entropy, just unpredictability. And some people are way on one side, some people are way on the other. And overall, the entire population, like especially globally, but even within a community, right, the overall average, right, it tends toward kind of the sum of that. But it's not because every individual person is average. It's because everyone's all over the place, and overall, everything kind of averages. And this is, I don't want to tangent too much into that, but there's a great study worth looking up called the flaw of averages.
Law of averages.
And so I'll do the quick 30-second version, but they measured Air Force crewmen, several thousand, and they measured like 30, 40 different dimensions, finger length, hand width, inseam, height, all this stuff. And then they designed all the early airplanes based on the average person of all like 40 of those.
Oh, no.
And then they were losing pilots left and right.
Yeah.
And like they're like, man, this doesn't seem like we should have this many crashes. So then this other guy went back through and he's like, well, wait a minute. Okay, so we have this mythical average person. So he got another few thousand people and he measured them again. And then he tried to find individuals, like who is the most average individual, right? Like the beginning of Idiocracy, the most average man, right? So he tried to find this, and what he found is on 3 dimensions, any 3 dimensions out of these like 40 that they measured, only a very tiny number of people fell within the average for all 3, any 3 that you choose.
Yeah.
And when he made it 4, no one fell within average parameters on 4 or more dimensions. So he's like, well, wait a minute. So this average of the population is a mathematical illusion. There is no such thing as an average person. Everyone has, different dimensions, longer arms, shorter fingers, like all this different stuff. It's all over the place. And you can't just take the aggregate average and then design for that and have it meet everyone's needs. It's not how it works. So they went back to the Air Force or the Boeing and the air manufacturers, planes, and they're like, hey, you need to give us adjustable seats. Like, we need the cockpit to be adjustable to fit our pilots. And they fought back initially, and they're like, it's going to cost too much. We're not doing it. And they finally are like, look, you do this and you get the money, or you don't. And then we find someone else. So like, fine. And they did make the cockpits adjustable. And suddenly the crash rate went way down because it actually, like when you're pulling 5 Gs and you try to pull back on the stick when your arm weighs 5 times what it normally does, it doesn't go well. If you can't reach it, you're just not going to be able to do that because you're straining. And anyway, so it's the flaw of averages study. If you want to search it, like it's a great illustration of this mathematical illusion. And I think we're looking at a similar kind of concept here with knowledge collapse, where there's these illusions of, the average is the right answer. The most popular thing is the right answer. It's like, but is it though? Is it actually?
Right.
We don't necessarily want to homogenize everyone's thought. And I guess the other way to take that, if you look at like tequila, right, growing agave plants, one of the problems with bananas and agave is we grow these things, like bananas aren't cloned, but agave is. And if there was a disease that affected blue agave, and there is currently a disease affecting the Cavendish banana, it's wiping out. This is the second banana extinction we've had.
Oh, wow.
The Gros Michel, which was a really good one that we used to have way back, it was bigger, it was sweeter, everything about it was a better banana. And this fungus just spread through all the banana plantations globally.
Yeah, because they're all too similar.
Yeah, and they just wiped out all of the bananas. So there's no more Gros Michel. There might be a few plants. If you go to some botanical garden or something, you might still be able to get your hands on a Gros Michel banana. But industrially, it's over. You can never grow those again. And then what happened, so we switched to the Cavendish, which wasn't quite as good, but if you're going to the store today in America, you're going to get a Cavendish. It's fine. That's what people think of bananas as.
I didn't know you were so much of a banana connoisseur. I fried plantains for the first time in like years the other day. They're so good, but
Hopas, man. They have them down there, like football-sized bananas, tree potatoes. Those are awesome. No, but it's interesting because what's happening now is that fungus mutated, and we replanted with Cavendish, and we reestablished globally like the banana trade, and now the same thing is happening.
Right.
And we're losing all this land where, again, the remediation of this, you have to like dig up all the soil and just incinerate it. So we are like 10, 20 years away from not having any more Cavendish bananas. Now, if you love bananas, for anyone watching the show, don't worry. There's like hundreds of different types of bananas. We'll just switch to another one again. There's also some work to maybe bring back the Gros Michel or like make the Cavendish a resistant variety. But this idea of homogenization in nature, you never see a monoculture. It's too fragile.
Right.
Any successful ecosystem has all kinds of weird stuff going on. So if one thing threatens one particular species in a niche, the overall system is resilient. And so this is the danger with AI is we don't want to homogenize humanity. That puts us at extreme risk by trying to make everyone kind of average and homogenized.
Right. So let's talk back to probably the first article then, talking about teachers catching students using ChatGPT. Earlier, we had a conversation about education in general, talking about training versus education, what that looks like. One of the interesting things that kind of pops up here is when you're in math class, and I already brought this up earlier on this recording, when you're in math class, K through 12 school, they force you to do everything by hand.
Yeah.
And so, well, why would I do it by hand? I would just use a calculator. And it's like, well, no, you need to learn that struggle. You need to understand how the numbers actually fit together and why they fit together. And so once you can do it by hand, then you can do it more quickly. And then you might not even need a calculator in certain instances, which is great. But now we're seeing with generative AI, it can do your math homework and it can do your English homework, writing essays. Most knowledge work jobs, you're going to have to write. You're going to have to write essays. You're going to have to write reports. You're going to have to write memos. You're going to have to write emails. So getting used to writing content that makes sense is going to help. And then that doesn't even get into reading, like the literary, like being able to do a literary critique on a piece of content. So whether that's a blog, whether that's an article, whether that's a news article, whether that's a book, being able to think about it critically is very important. And so if you introduce generative AI to offload all of that struggle, you're not going to be able to do some of those things. And so people are going to come across, there's this term of, oh, this person believes the last thing they heard. You're going to see a lot of that. Like, oh, I read a news article. It's like, okay, but where did that come from? What did they actually say? Based on the things that they're saying, they're using these logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies? How do we identify consistency through these things? What, for fiction, what might be the symbolism? Even though they're saying one thing, it means something else.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how it's impacting students and how it's impacting teachers, because a lot of teachers, some of them, from what I saw, and this is where I was trolling around Reddit for a little bit, what I saw, some of the teachers are embracing AI and they're saying, hey, we can't change the future, but we need to educate the students on how to more responsibly use AI and why they shouldn't use AI in these certain circumstances, instead of just saying, no, don't do it because I say so. Whereas other teachers are saying, hey, I have all my students, they're using ChatGPT, and I'm catching them because, one, they're using words like perplexity. This is fourth grade. I asked them, what does perplexity mean? They have no idea. They get stunned and they're completely shocked. Or they wrote something, it's a beautifully well-written 5-paragraph essay, but this is coming from a student who couldn't string 3 sentences together.
Yeah, and that was the tip-off in that article, is this little girl was struggling, and then all of a sudden she turns in this paper that's like college-level work. And so the teacher's like, wait a minute. And she looks at the document history because they're using Google Docs. And there's just like a little bit of fragments of stuff in there. And then all of a sudden, just all of this text with really big words.
Paste.
And then some other edits. I think the mom went through and she cleaned up and made some of the words smaller to try to kind of hide the fact that it was generated. But it wasn't enough. And so the problem is, what is the point of writing these papers, right? Is it to just have the paper turn that in for the grade?
Yeah.
In which case, cool, done. But I would argue, and I would think hopefully teachers would argue, that it's not the paper. That's an artifact, but we don't actually care. It's the process that goes into creating that paper that we're hoping that they learn and have that ability to do not just summarization, but ideally synthesis.
Synthesis is the important word there, yeah. And that's what I was seeing on some of the teachers' accounts, is saying, no, we want, if we're going to give you something to read, one, we want to make sure that you can read and that you actually understand it. So be able to read it, deconstruct what you read, think critically about it, and then reinterpret it in your own words, because that's the process you need to go through if you're going to read either fiction or nonfiction. And
there's a great comic that I saw way back a year or two ago on, I just asked, ChatGPT to, I take a set of bullet points and ask it to make a whole big report based on these. And then the next panel, she's like, I take these huge reports and I ask ChatGPT to just give me bullet points.
Right.
And so the question there is then, when you're summarizing, what are you losing? Because the specific words that were chosen sometimes are really, really important. And this is how, again, a lot of these kids are getting caught, because the words don't make sense. They're not in their voice, or there's just there's a voice, there's a pattern that shouldn't be there or should be there and isn't. And that is used to great effect in some writing, right? The exact poetry or just more intricate novels, like the exact words chosen are chosen very carefully. And there's some poems that you can't translate from one language to another because there's certain puns and things that work in one language, but just they're not there in the other language. And so you lose a bit. And so if everyone's now consuming stuff by not actually reading it and just dumping this all in a language model and reading the bullet points, like what are they taking from it?
I like there was a quote from Slavoj Žižek where he was saying, no, I love that students are using AI. They should make AI generated papers so that the teachers can grade it with AI. And then we just completed the circle.
Why do we need people?
Right.
I mean, they literally had a thing that they're like, it'll just be AI generating stuff so AI can buy stuff. And then we can just get rid of all the people and capitalism can march along without any people.
Everybody can take their own vacations. It frees up everyone's time. It's great.
But if AI is making all the money, you won't have the money to take the vacation.
Money at that point?
Just warehouse the people, put them off to the side. You have a whole economy that's just machines doing random stuff to make money happen, whatever that means anymore, right?
I mean, it kind of makes sense with that whole rise of bullshit jobs. But going back to students, it was really interesting the teachers that were like embracing AI, because what they were saying is, hey, what I do, because I know my students are going to use it, right? Mm-hmm. Kids, they know ChatGPT exists. They don't know that what we can do to find out they're using ChatGPT, but they know it exists. So let's embrace ChatGPT and let's actually, or any other LLM, it doesn't matter. ChatGPT is just the famous one. Yeah. But let's embrace it, and then let's start like day one actually teaching them what it does, what it lacks, why you would want to use it, why you wouldn't want to use it, and then how they get caught. Yeah. So that they have a better understanding of what exactly it is they're doing. Because from a child's perspective, and I understand, like this was me as well, from a child's perspective, the goal, the end is the goal, right? So the paper is the goal. And it's like, no, the paper is not the goal. I want to understand, I want to know that you understand these things. Again, reading comprehension, synthesis, critical thinking, etc. But the only way I can know that you are receiving that is through the paper. And so I need you to write this paper, not because the paper is important. It's because I need you to understand these things.
And this goes to the B-sides discussion, right? Like, if you don't care, then the paper's the goal. And cheating is an optimization. Oh, you just want the paper for a grade because you don't actually care either? Cool, here, I got it to you faster. But you give up the deeper understanding. You give up the process of learning about whatever you're writing about. And it's, I don't know, I'm trying to think without tangenting too far. I'm trying to think how to bring that back to the topic. There are some downsides to over-automating some of this. And I think that I don't want to go back in, because we already covered that on the B-sides, but I don't want to go back deep into what should schooling look like. But like this is an optimization. Here, I found a way to give you what you're asking for. Right. But it's like, but what's the point? Are you actually
optimizing
learning?
On the wrong thing? Yeah.
Yeah. And the tools, like the best thing I've seen to kind of counteract this is going back to those drastic changes we had talked about, is flip it now. Like adaptability. That's the key in the modern age, is how adaptable are you? So this was like 2 years ago. And when people were first starting to get really worried about ChatGPT in schooling, this one teacher, I'm like, that's brilliant. And I've seen a few other people doing the same thing. Instead of you like, hey, write me this paper and I'll grade it, which grading takes a lot of time. It's a lot of work. It's like, hey, I use ChatGPT to write you a paper about this topic. You, the student, go grade it and figure out what's right and what's wrong.
That could be useful.
And that's brilliant, because now you're flipping it. So now it's really easy for the teacher to go in and like 20, 30, 40 times just generate a whole bunch of papers. And now the student is understanding what grading is all about, which is a useful skill to have to be able to actually analyze. And so they don't have to write anything, but now they have to go and actually find out. And now they're actually directly seeing, where did it fail? Where did it misspeak? So there are ways, if we're willing to like really mix up education, to effectively use, and instead of trying to fit it into the existing model, to like flip the model. This is like even more flipped. You hear flipped classroom.
Right.
This is a more flipped version of that. Yeah, I'll write the paper, you grade it now. Good luck. So brilliant.
Remix the remix and get right back to the original.
Yeah.
No, so that is something that I would have appreciated when I was younger, simply because when you read a textbook, for example, you're in high school and you get a textbook and you read through that, it's a very passive process in my mind.
Yeah.
There are ways that you can read textbooks, and now how I read nonfiction, it's very active, where I have a specific goal that I want to achieve, and so I need to go through the textbook and understand the certain thing. But I can't just I can't just flip to the last page and understand what it's talking about. I have to go through the previous pages to understand how it got to that conclusion at the last page. And so if you give students that grading assignment, essentially, now they have a reason to go through the textbook or whatever it is they're reading, but they're looking for specific things and saying like, okay, here's what they're saying, but here's the context of what they're saying. And so because that context is missing from what's in the ChatGPT paper, then I can kind of understand and say, oh, this is right if you took it at face value, but it's wrong if you accept the context. Now we need to talk about the context. And then it'll click and say, oh, shit, this is how I write my reports.
and that's a great point. And I think part of the problem is most textbooks are just really joyless. Right?
They're not written for consumption. They're written to be purchased.
Yes. Yeah. And we won't get into the whole textbook industry, but they're written in a certain style that tends not to be very fun to read. There's a few exceptions, but for the most part, they're pretty bad. And they don't cater to people who are really interested in the topic because they eschew a lot of detail. They give you just kind of the basics. It's already kind of a ChatGPT type summary. And if you're really into that topic, it's disappointing. And so let's look at like chemistry. Reading like Derek Lowe's blog posts versus a textbook. His posts are awesome and hilarious. Just the phrases he uses talking. He has a great thing called Things I Won't Work With. And he talks about these really dangerous chemicals, some that are like super stinky, some that will blow you up if you look at them sideways, like all this crazy stuff. And it's so fun to read, even if you don't care about chemistry. And so I think that's part of the problem, going back to the ChatGPT stuff, is you are much more likely that ChatGPT voice is much more like a textbook, and it suck some of the joy out of reading something that's really cleverly and well written. And if you're now filtering everything you consume through a language model, like you're really doing yourself a disservice. You're missing a lot of stuff, even ignoring. Let's pretend somehow magically, which I don't think is possible, but let's pretend that hallucinations aren't a thing, even though that's kind of how these models work. Even if it's perfect every time, the summary's perfect, you're missing all this extra information in the words chosen and the anecdotes shared.
Right.
Those aren't in the summary. They don't need to be in the summary, right? And so you're just cheating yourself out of the richer experience of this field. And there was a great article about just read the original paper, right? Like people are like, well, I want a summary of like the theory of relativity. And they're like, just read the original paper. Like people read these analyses of these seminal scientific works, and they're like 5 times longer. They're more poorly written. They're like, the original paper is like some guy's like, hey, I had a thought and I wrote it down, and it's only a few pages because they've just invented the whole field. So there isn't a ton of stuff you can say. It's not 300 pages. It's like 5 pages. It's very easy to understand. Right. And then people took that and then they started adding all this mathematical rigor, and it got way more complicated. So the later papers are very long and verbose and complex. But a lot of times these initial papers that introduce a field are really, just go read the thing, man. It's 5 pages. It's a good read. It'll be fun. And you can see where it all started. And I think people get too intimidated and they start just always looking for the shortcut. And sometimes the shortcut is not the shortcut. It's the long way around that it's just worse in every way.
Well, I don't know. I think it's more about the process, because the process of consuming a summary is much easier if you're able to consume those more consistently. It's much easier than going through and reading the original paper. There's a lot of papers that I wish more people would read, especially in the cybersecurity side, like Why Johnny Can't Encrypt is a fantastic paper.
Yes, definitely.
And
On Trusting Trust.
On Trusting Trust, that's exactly what I was going to say. That's not a paper, that's a presentation. You only have the slides.
And Weird Machines. Anyway, if you're in cybersecurity,
you
look
like
up Weird
you
Machines.
Like Weird Machines.
Bradison Dullian, please.
I actually went through and read some of those. It was like months ago. I can't remember it right now. But
the original one is one of those really short papers. Just anyway.
Yeah, kind of going back to like students and teachers, I think that it's really interesting, some of these challenges that the teachers have now, because essentially, and that was kind of what we had in our previous conversation, is teachers are being measured based on how many students they're able to basically pump into the system. Yeah. And so some of the lament outside of the generative AI is, hey, I teach junior and senior level high school. They're reading at a 3rd and a 4th grade reading level.
Yeah.
Like I can't teach them effectively because they don't have the background of where I need to be. Now all this generative AI is just adding another log to that fire.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to see if you're a teacher and you're in that situation, do you embrace AI? Do you disincentivize AI? When you find a student who's using AI to cheat, do you call them out? Do you pull them aside and have a normal conversation?
Yeah.
It's
I mean, I think
really
it goes back to what we
interesting
talked about.
how varied the responses are.
I think it goes back to paradox of automation. I mean, it allows students who, again, it's not all bad, but it allows students who are struggling to do better and create work product. And there is an argument to be made on the positive side that, yeah, maybe I'm not great at writing. I don't want to say dyslexia, but like maybe there's something where I will never be amazing at writing, and I can use AI kind of like spell check, but I can be like, hey, I wrote this thing. All the facts are in there. Like I did the research. The facts are good. Can you rewrite this so that it reads better? And make sure all the facts and everything that I put in here, use this and rewrite it in a style that's better. So I think that's potentially like a very good thing for some people who, like some people just are bad at certain things, and it just try as they might, their brain structure, it's awesome at other things, but it's just going to be bad at this forever.
Right.
It's kind of like asking someone who's colorblind, right, to do color-related work, right? They just don't physically have the ability to see that color. So, and there's ways they could still be incredibly good at everything else, but if you can augment that with tech, now they have some options. Now, that's the positive side. The flip side of that is you can also mask the problem. And instead of dealing with the problem, if it's not something that you cannot ever possibly change or overcome, but it's something you need to work a little harder. Like this goes back to like growth mindset and grit, which anyway.
Well, I was thinking even simpler than that, audiobooks versus reading, physically reading.
Yeah.
So you get the content with an audiobook, which is great, but you can still be illiterate. And that's the problem.
Yes. And the other thing, too, the experience of reading, the one thing that's amazing about reading text versus almost any other way, video or audio, is the speed at which you read text is 100% under your control. You get to decide, right?
You can skim, you can skip sections.
You can skim, you can read and be like, wait a minute, and go back. Like, and the amount of effort to go back and read it again, like, yeah, you can scrub a video, you can hit rewind 5 seconds.
Right.
But it's not the same. Like literally your brain is just controlling the exact speed, and the speed can be nonlinear. Yeah. You can be blasting through and see something interesting, slow down and really study that and speed back up. And so there is something to be said for like text is a really good way. It's not perfect, not for everything, right? Sometimes a picture is much more effective if you need to communicate visual stuff. But for a lot of things and concepts, text is the ideal way to get through that concept, to consume that information.
Right.
So yeah, what are we losing? And like we said, if you're only reading summaries, if you're not reading, you're not getting better at reading. There's no way to just get better at reading. This isn't the Matrix, like just load in me being a speed reader, right? It's like it's not how it works. You got to do the thing.
Before we wrap up, something that I want to bring up as well, because we've been talking about literary stuff, but you can use large language models for mathematics, or you can even use Wolfram Alpha for mathematics. I've lately been watching, and they're short videos. They're like 3 minutes long.
Well, wait a minute.
Really,
we got to go back to that for a second. That was literally designed as like a symbolic platform to do mathematics. So yes, of course you can use Wolfram Alpha.
Right,
I don't want people who aren't familiar to conflate.
But I don't want a fourth grader using Wolfram Alpha.
No, but they are very different. Like it's literally designed specifically to be a very reliable mathematical platform.
Yes.
So
we're talking about the cheating aspect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. So lately I've been watching some videos, and they're short videos, again, 3 minutes long. How do you find the area? Like, here's some weird shapes. How do you find the area of these shapes?
Yeah.
And so when you watch enough of these videos, you notice that what they're doing is, all right, I have a circle inside of a square and next to like some other circle, but I only have certain measurements. But we need to find the area of this shaded region. How do we figure that out? And so what they do is they start with, okay, here's how we find the area of all the things that we have information on. There's certain variables that we don't have answers to. But then we know where the center point of the circle is. We know the radius of the circle based on the diameter, or based on like the length of the square. And so here's 3 lines, and we can make that into a right triangle. And then we can use Pythagorean theorem in order to figure out what the missing information is. And then we can put that together, and that's how we get the measurements that we can plug in to find the area of this. And then we subtract whatever the constraint is, whatever else we have. And so you watch enough of these videos and you notice they're doing the same thing over and over again. They're finding a right triangle, they're doing Pythagorean's theorem, and they're using that to identify the missing values. And then they use those missing values to plug into what their goal is, right? Find the area of X.
Yeah.
And so that's critical thinking. You go through enough of those problems, and then you can take a more complicated challenge. Something I had to do for a business that I work at is if we have a certain number of people that are signed up to contracts that go for like 3 years. And so this is how much they're paying. This is our ARR for those contracts. In 3 years, we're bringing new customers on board, but their contracts are like 30, 50% higher than what we currently have. Here's the total number of customers that we have. Yeah. Here is the average contract value, the ACV. Here's the average contract value of all of the contracts. My question that I was trying to answer is, based on how many existing contracts we have and their current ACV, how much would the new contracts have to be on average for just that chunk? So I had to start doing some mathematical calculations and say, okay, here is, say we were assuming we're going to have like 61 customers, but we have 19 right now, and that means we're going to have 42 new customers between now and 3 years from now. Cool. 19 of those are locked in at this ACV value. So now I only have 42 to play with, so I have to remove whatever their total contract number is from the total contract number based off of the average, and then I calculate the new average, and I realize, and this is where I can have that conversation and say, hey, this is not a realistic projection, because if we keep those 19 at the original price point, we have to put the new 42 on average at our highest price point, which is not how averages work.
Okay, so tie this back in, because I'm not sure I'm following on the AI tie-in with this.
Yeah, the AI tie-in is shortcuts. If you're taking shortcuts, if you're asking ChatGPT, hey, what's the answer to this? It'll give you the answer. Cool, you have the answer. That's not the point. The point is being able to think critically, being able to solve the problem, and being able to use familiar formulas, again, Pythagorean's theorem or even averages, in new and interesting ways to achieve a new result.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the thing that's coming to my mind, which is not quite the same but related, there's a wonderful website called betterexplained.com that has mathematical stuff. And I forget if it was my niece, someone I was helping with math, a younger person. I think it was my niece. And I was looking through the site because I'm like, I want to show this to her. I think it's really helpful. And they have a trigonometry thing. And I mean, I took trig. I thought I did decently. I thought it was pretty cool. I didn't have any issues with it.
I love trig. Trig's great.
But I never, you have sin, like sine, cosine, tangent, etc. You have all these other variants of sinh, const, like all these other, there's so many of these. And I kind of understood them, but there's this wonderful, just 2 pictures on Better Explained, and it shows a triangle, and it's all cut up.
Yeah.
And it labels every last little bit of how these triangles and how they intersect other shapes.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, it's the cheat code. Yeah. Like, I want this distance. Oh, that's sinh, right? And it just, by putting it all together in one place, like showing you the relationship between all these angles, it crystallized things. And I think that's something where that one's just good information design, but that's something I'd like to see with kind of AI is how can we have those moments where like everything crystallizes and you have that deeper understanding of how these are all related. And I think there's potential there, but we'll have to probably save that for another episode. So I think there's some positives, but it's definitely going to be an adjustment period in the meantime.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I want to sign off with kind of a call to action. I want to see of the audience, what are your perspectives? What do you think is going to happen in the future of education when we have generative AI and not even just AI, like automated tools, Wolfram Alpha, for example, that can do some of this work for us? What are the things that we need to continue struggling with? What are some of the things that we can offload and actually give to the AI or give to those automation tools and not lose as much content as we need? Or maybe we can go back and re-reference stuff. So
yeah,
I'll leave you with that. And for now, this is Ethical Algorithm signing off. This is Gavin
and Elio.
Have a good day.